there's a certain type of person that always wants to dwell on the worst case scenario. So you're like, oh my God, please don't send me to this place that I really don't want to go. What am I going to do if it flashes up there? Am I still going to like do this whole thing? And so there are a lot of people in the room with sort of like crossed fingers who are just, you can tell that they're just like, please don't let it be one location. And there were people in the room who got one of their lows, and you can really see it on their face. I mean, plenty of them cry while they're out there, they're getting their flight. Yeah, and you got your family in the room. So it's crazy because once the whole thing's over, we're all still in there. So maybe half of the room is sort of celebrating, oh my God, I got one of my highs. Family, friends, I'm so excited. Oh my God, new diplomatic life. And then there's another chunk of the room that's sort of like weeping into their, father's shoulder because they don't know what they're gonna, they've got their low and now they have to figure out if they're still gonna go through with it.
In today's episode, we're joined by Alexis Alexander, a former diplomat with a fascinating career journey. Alexis served with the U.S. Department of State from 2011 to 2021, undertaking high-profile overseas assignments in Mexico, Israel, and Afghanistan. After a decade of diplomatic service, she transitioned to the tech industry in Austin, Texas. As the host and creator of the Off Duty Diplomat podcast, Alexis explores the intricacies of foreign policy and the real-life experiences of diplomacy. In our conversation today, we'll dive into her unique experiences, the challenges she faced, and the lessons she's learned along the way. So let's dive in. Hi, I'm Dustin, and I am here with Alexis Alexander, who is a diplomat, and we're going to discuss some of her time during the 10 years that she was a diplomat. So thank you so much for being here.
Hi there. Yeah, so glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So I'm going to get right into this because first of all, I want to let everybody know that I heard about you because you have an excellent podcast, which I have been listening to and trying to catch up on. It explains your 10 years as a diplomat. And so I wanted to have you on so that you could explain to people what a diplomat is, because I think a lot of people think that a diplomat is an ambassador. So it's the ambassador to another country and that's it. So when I was listening to your podcast, I learned more. So can you start off by telling us a little bit about your background?
Sure, absolutely. So, as you said, I was with the U.S. Department of State for 10 years, most of that as a Foreign Service officer, as a diplomat. Before that, I was in school. I have a master's degree from American University in international politics. My undergraduate degree is in post-conflict justice and conflict resolution, and I actually spent some time interning at the United Nations while I was getting that degree. Before that, I had lived abroad for a little while in French West Africa and Senegal, which is really where it's sort of stoked my interest and my desire to live an international lifestyle, check out diplomacy, consider it as a full-time career. Sort of fast forward to 2021, I started thinking about making a transition in my career life, and I ended up leaving the State Department and moving to Austin, Texas, which is when I started putting together my ideas for the podcast, and we launched that in August of 2023.
Wow, that's amazing. So could you start us off with explaining what a diplomat or foreign services officer is? They're not just ambassadors.
No. So really technically the term of who you would call a diplomat is anyone who's under chief of mission authority at an embassy overseas. So I know that's kind of a very technical term, but the way the United States diplomatic service is set up, there are what are called civil service employees, and then there are foreign service employees. The foreign service employees that work at the Department of State are all official diplomats. They have diplomatic credentials, they get diplomatic passports, they're sent out on, regular, what we call tours of duty, overseas to embassies across the world. And sort of at the very top of that chain, you have the ambassadors who have their, own ranking system, and they have to be confirmed by the Senate. So there's a much more sort of official process for those at the very top of the chain, all the way down to people at the working level, coming in brand new, just starting out. So there's a whole career track involved in it, but ambassador is sort of where you end up if you make it to the top.
Got it. So you said you were in Senegal. You said when you decided that this was a career path you wanted. What was it in Senegal that made you decide upon going in this career path?
Sure. Yeah, I just really love interacting with different cultures and pushing myself outside of my normal boundaries. Senegal is a francophone country, so a lot of the official transactions are going to be in French. But more than that, there are roughly like 6 or 7 local languages that are pretty, common to use in the country, and sort of just figuring how to navigate, all of that language soup and different culture, different traditions. Senegal is really unique because it's both a Christian and Muslim country that is functioning really well between those two groups. And so you'll see a real mix of those religious traditions and sort of that cultural history as you go about daily life. I think it's just so invigorating for me to be existing in another country, in another culture. And I knew from that moment onward, I'm like, I'm going to be outside of America for some good chunk of my life.
So it must have been a very enjoyable experience.
It was, and it was hard also. I ended up doing, I don't know if, how much of your audience has sort of been outside the US, but in a lot of other cultures, it's very common to haggle over pricing for things and like regular stuff. You go to the, equivalent of a grocery store and you're haggling over the price of potatoes and meat and everything else you're going to buy there versus what we do in the US, which is you have a fixed price, you go to the register, that's the end of the day. And so I was always fascinated by how the sellers would be setting their prices. And I'm like, well, if you don't have a set price, you must be expecting people to pay within a certain range. So I did this whole capstone project on price discrimination, decision making in the marketplace. And I interviewed all these different sellers and these different customers. I had blind customers go out and buy something and see how their, prices were changing. And I don't know, there's something about the international experience that really lights me up.
I can share your enthusiasm because I've also lived outside the country, so I totally get it. So getting back to the entire process, you had to take a test, obviously. And then once you pass that test, then what happens?
Sure. So the traditional path for becoming a Foreign Service Officer is really, you can say, 3 parts. The first part is the written exam. The written exam is mostly looking for people's understanding and aptitude for, like, how does the American government work? What are the basics of American history? Can you read and write in English fluently and communicate your ideas clearly? Once you pass the written exam, they usually will ask you to do what's called a personal narrative questionnaire.
Oh, interesting.
And the personal narrative is basically your sort of about me. I like to call it kind of the beauty pageant portion of the system because they really want to hear your story, sort of your American story. How do you understand your American experience? Why do you want to be a diplomat? What are you hoping to get out of the experience? What are you hoping to contribute to the sort of process of American diplomacy? And then the third and final step, once you get past the personal narrative questionnaire, is going to be the oral exam, which is a day-long process where you do a series of different assessments individually and in groups while you're observed by the examiners. And they're looking for you to display a series of different character traits and skill sets. And they don't give you a lot of information about it ahead of time. Usually you know very little going in. And they keep it randomized on purpose so that they can see you sort of really reacting in real time to situations that you might encounter as a diplomat.
Now, that sounds like it would be like the most challenging part of the test because I'm assuming they put you into like you said, a challenging situation where you have to react, but I'm assuming you can't react from your own personal standpoint, but you have to react from the standpoint of the U.S. government.
Yes, I think they're also looking for what is your decision-making process when you're faced with a challenge.
Oh, interesting.
How do you handle being uncomfortable? How do you handle navigating interpersonal challenges? Is your first instinct to sort of seek more information? Is your first instinct to draw more people in? Is your instinct to sort of identify what the assets are and, start horse trading for them? It's really interesting to see how different people sort of respond when they're given the information because usually the scenarios they walk you through are quite broad and they really want to see how you think through it from beginning to end.
And so there's really no way for you to prepare for this aspect of the test, is there?
Yeah, I mean, the way most people prepare for this process, there are all kinds of like Facebook groups and all kinds of other communities that exist online where people get some practice materials and try and work through them in groups or individually. And I've seen people have a lot of success, but The oral exam is where most people sort of fall out of the foreign service process. It is very
Oh,
difficult. When
okay.
I was a diplomat, I knew people who had gone through it 7 times before they
Wow.
passed.
They stayed with it though. That's amazing that they stuck with it and didn't give up after like 3 times or four. That takes a lot of tenacity, and maybe that's what they're looking for as well. Who knows? So once you pass the test, I was listening to your podcast and you mentioned that there is a day where you all find out where you will be stationed. Tell us about that process, because that sounded both heart wrenching and disappointing and exciting. And people were like, and during one point of the podcast, you mentioned people were like, I did not get the station I wanted, so I'm out of here. And I'm like, what? You went through all of that. So take us through that particular part once you've passed and they're giving you the particular place that you will be stationed.
Sure. So once you pass the whole process, you go on what's called the register. Once you're called off the register, they ask you officially to join what they call an A100 class. And that's basically a diplomat orientation. And it's 6 weeks. You're together with everybody else, with probably 80 other diplomats, and you're all given the exact same list. So basically, day 2 of your orientation, they give you the list of possible locations you could go to. So it's all the locations that are available and all of the jobs in those positions that are available. And you spend a lot of that time kind of really asking yourself hard questions. Wow, do I want to do this job in this location? What would that look like? What's the housing like there? Are there schools for my kids? What's the commute like? Are there like special weather conditions to be aware of? What's the political system like in this country? Because maybe I've never considered working there and I don't know anything about this place. So if there are, let's say, 80 officers in the class, there'll be 80 positions on the list. Everyone is going somewhere. And what they will do is invite you to rank them all high, medium, and low. You get a certain number of lows, if I recall correctly, and a certain number of highs, just because they don't want you ranking everything one thing. And, everything's low except for one location.
Right.
But yeah, so then you hand in your paper, I believe after about 2 weeks. And then at the end of that 6-week period, that final day they call Flag Day. And all of us are gathered in a room. They invite you to like bring your partner, have your children come. If you have family that can come, then they ask you to invite them as well. So you might have parents in the room, you might have siblings in there. And one by one, they will call you up by name. And so when you walk up and, they're holding a flag, and then they'll flash a big flag on the screen for everyone else to see what country it is you got. And then they'll say the name. And it's so... exactly as you described. It is a very intense, very dramatic moment. None of us know what's coming. You spend so much of the time that you're in the orientation class sort of speculating with everybody else. Oh, I came in with this language and I saw that they have it on the list, so maybe I'll get to go there. Or, I purposely didn't rank this one as high as the other one because I knew 2 other people really wanted, they're going to rank it high. So, we're all trying to game the system. Nobody knows how it works. It's totally like a black box. There's no way to know. But yeah, you walk up there and you get your flag. When I was going through it, I got one of my medium choices was Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And it was perfectly fine. I was not disappointed really at all. But it was a surprise just because there are 80 options on there. And I think, there's a certain type of person that always wants to dwell on the worst case scenario. So you're like, oh my God, please don't send me to this place. I really don't want to go. What am I going to do if it flashes up there? I'm still going to do this whole thing. And so there are a lot of people in the room with sort of crossed fingers who are just, you can tell that they're just please don't let it be one location. And there were people in the room who got one of their lows. Ooh. And you can really see it on their face. I mean, plenty of them cry while they're getting their flag. Yeah, you got your family in the room. So it's crazy because once the whole thing's over, we're all still in there. So maybe half of the room is sort of celebrating. Oh my God, I'm in my highs. Family, friends, I'm so excited. Oh my God, new diplomatic life. And then there's another chunk of the room that's sort of weeping into their, father's shoulder because they don't know what they're going to, they got their low and now they have to figure out if they're still going to go through with it.
So you said you got your medium the first time. So can you tell us where you went over the 10 years that you were a diplomat?
Sure. So I started out to backtrack a tiny bit,
sure.
I actually came in as a Wrangell Foreign Affairs Fellow. And as
Okay.
part of that fellowship program, I did an internship at an embassy abroad of my choice before I
Nice.
officially joined. So I was at the embassy in Zimbabwe in the economic section for 4 months. And then after I officially joined, I was sent to Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. That was where I did my consular tour. And then I did Tel Aviv, Israel, embassy in Tel Aviv, which is where I was the deputy spokesperson. And then I got sent to Kabul, Afghanistan, and I was a cultural affairs officer there from 2018 to 2020.
So what part does language play in going to your high, medium, or low spot, or does it play a part at all?
You know, Dustin, that is a much debated topic amongst us. There really nobody knows, but I would conjecture that there are sort of hard languages and really difficult to fill languages that the department's always looking for. So if you come in with one of those very niche languages and the department happens to have a high need for it, I think it's more likely that you'll be sent to that country.
Oh,
I came in
interesting.
with French. I never got to serve in a French-speaking location over the course of my career.
Wow.
It just didn't happen. And there were plenty of places on the list that I was given. They just didn't select it. I do have my own personal theory, which again has not been corroborated, not official. But I think the department likes to see us outside of our comfort zone. And I think that they really want us to stretch ourselves. So if you're someone who comes in with a strong background in Korean or Spanish, I think they really want to see how you do when you're given a totally new context, a culture, and language to work with. So I ended up learning Spanish and Hebrew over the course of my career. And again, I came in with great French. I was in a French-speaking office at the United Nations when I was interning, and of course in French West Africa. So I was sure I was a shoo-in, but it just didn't happen.
That's so interesting. It's almost like they're trying to train you, even though they've placed you in these particular geographic locations. You would think that they would want the people who are really proficient in these languages, but it sounds like they want you there, but they also want to challenge you. And yeah, it seems like a lot. It seems like a lot. So that's so cool though. Do they give you lessons like when you learned Hebrew and when you learned the other languages? Is this something that they do, or is this basically on the job type of training? How does that work?
Sure. I mean, 9 times out of 10, our jobs have what are called language requirements. So when you're bidding on a job, it'll show you, oh, you need to have this level of Spanish or this level of Mandarin in order to do this job. So we usually are assigned a certain length of training for the language ahead of
Okay.
time to prep us. If you don't already have that score in your file, then they'll build it into your sort of transition to the next country. And there is a School of Foreign Affairs training in languages very close to DC that all of us are assigned to normally to complete our language training. They have language instructors from all over the world in dozens and dozens of languages to get us prepped up and ready. I studied Spanish for 6 months to
Wow.
get to professional proficiency, and then I studied Hebrew for 9 months to get to professional proficiency.
So do you have to go through the flag day each time, or is it just the initial time when you go
Just do it that first time.
okay. And then after that, is it a little bit better as far as where you can go, or is it still like you can put in your high, medium, and low, but you're not given any special preference because you've already served?
I think it still is very much the luck of the draw as you move
Okay.
forward. So your first two assignments as a diplomat in the American system are what we call directed assignments.
Okay.
Meaning that the department will decide where you're going. The assignments office has final say. They are going to make the full decision and they just let you know. After you finish those first two assignments and you get what's called tenured, you have to start bidding and lobbying for your jobs. So
Interesting.
you're still a diplomat no matter what, but you've got to identify the office and the timing. You got to reach out to them and interview. You got to give references to them, and it's quite a process.
Does that mean, so if you have to do all of that, does that mean that an assignment is only so long? You can't just stay there and you either have to find another place or leave the service?
Well, you got to find another place. Now the thing is, most of us become diplomats because we want to be out in the world,
Right.
exploring and sort of doing the work in the field. But there are lots and lots of diplomatic jobs at the State Department in Washington, D.C. That need to be filled. So, usually the overseas jobs are much more heavily bid. And then people who don't get those jobs will kind of like look around and see, okay, what's there in D.C.? I might have to come back for a minute before I can go back out into the field. So there are jobs, there's no scenario in which someone just won't have anything, but you might have to compromise a bit.
And come back to the U.S. for a little while if your intent is to be outside of the U.S. Okay, that makes sense. So we have not talked about what you actually did. What did you do?
Sure. So in Ciudad Juarez, I was a consular officer, and for those who don't know, consular work are basically the people who you call if anything goes wrong when you're traveling outside the U.S.
Oh,
so they're
okay.
in charge of creating and issuing passports for Americans who are living overseas. They're in charge of giving out consular reports of birth abroad, which is the equivalent of a birth certificate if you have a baby outside of the U.S. and you want them to be registered as an American from birth. They do death duties and death reports. So if somebody who's an American citizen dies overseas, they handle contacting the family back in the U.S. and helping them figure out how to move the remains if that's what they choose to do. We also do a lot of visiting American citizens who are in prison overseas and potentially helping them access resources that are necessary. And that's on top of the bread and butter of consular work, which is doing immigrant and non-immigrant visa interviews for people who are not Americans but would like to come to the U.S. either for tourism, study, work, fill in the blank.
And so did you have the same position across all of the locations that you, oh, it was different. Okay.
Yeah, so Mexico was a consular tour. I spent 2 years doing immigrant and non-immigrant visa interviews day after day in Spanish. I think I estimated I interviewed roughly 20,000 people over that time period.
That's amazing. Wow.
It's a big load. And then when I was in Israel, I was the deputy spokesperson at the embassy. So I was in the spokesperson's office in charge of all of our media and digital outreach. So all of the social media accounts for the embassy and the ambassador, as well as visiting VIPs who would come in. I did a ton of work on VIP visits because that was 2016 to 2018. So it was the Trump transition, which meant that everybody in that administration wanted to come and meet all of the sort of big wigs in the country. So I ended up supporting 13 cabinet level or White House visits during that 2-year tour, which is high level event planning, high stakes event planning.
Wow.
And then when I was in Afghanistan, I was managing a grants portfolio for cultural and educational outreach. So the English Access Banker Scholarship Program. I also managed a grant for outdoor American spaces across Afghanistan. That whole portfolio ended up being worth roughly $12 million in outreach grants across the country.
So it sounds like they've given you more responsibility with each place that you went to, or is that random? Could they have given you the last responsibility the first time?
It was totally random. I just had a very uniquely kind of high profile career, my very short time that I was in. I just happened to kind of go from hotspot to hotspot, but there are plenty of people who it doesn't go that way.
Really? Okay. So thinking of your different positions, did you ever find that your race was something that people did not deal with well, or that they did deal with well? And my second question is, how much did your nationality with the local people, how did they treat you?
Sure. I can kind of just go 1, 2, 3. I guess in Juarez, for those who don't know, Ciudad Juarez is right on the border of the United States with El Paso. So it's sort of a very unique space where there's all of this sort of mixture of culture and history between the US and Mexico. So they were not at all surprised to see me. I think maybe my Spanish accent was throwing people off a little bit because most of my Spanish teachers for language had been Colombian.
Oh.
So I'm just this black girl with a Colombian accent. They're like, well, that's okay. So I think that threw people off a little bit, but I never encountered any real racial issues or disrespect. I actually had a really lovely time in Mexico. I have zero complaints about that experience in terms of living there and experiencing it. When I was in Israel, things did get more complex. Israel is quite a diverse country ethnically because the Jewish diaspora are all over the world, came from everywhere. There are significant, you could say, sub-Saharan African populations within Israel, either as refugees or as citizens, the Ethiopians who came in the 80s and 90s. So it's not crazy to see a black person walking around in Israel. But obviously my Hebrew wasn't any good.
Even after 9 months?
Well, not compared to someone who grew up speaking it.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, I can get by, but again, it's the accent. My main Hebrew teacher was a Hungarian woman.
Okay.
And so it was the accent where people were like, that's strange, or even just generationally, I'm not using the slang a person might use in our
Oh,
because I don't
okay.
know it. Like, that's not a part of official diplomatic language training. So
Right.
that's kind of where it would come up more, and we'd have more of a conversation about my background and so on. I did have some unfortunate racial related issues happen there. Some of that had to do with my own colleagues at the embassy. Some of that had to do with the colleagues that I encountered out in the Israeli press. But I don't know. I think on the whole, Israel was probably the most difficult transition from a cultural perspective, just because it's a high contact culture. You're going to talk to people no matter what you're doing. There's going to be interaction. It might be conflict oriented. I think if you become a diplomat, you're probably self-selecting as someone who is conflict averse, so avoidant. Otherwise, you wouldn't be a diplomat.
Right,
Right.
right.
Part of the job. So that one, I did have some encounters that were unpleasant, and it was a tricky one to navigate because I obviously am here in my professional capacity. I need to remain professional and diplomatic, and at the same time, I'm not going to let myself be treated with disrespect. But I think I was young enough and early enough in my career where I was kind of just taken aback each time something would happen. It would take me a while to sort of process afterward and figure out, okay, I think next time I would do this or say this.
Thanks for tuning in to Dustin's Kaleidoscope. I hope you are enjoying this discussion with former diplomat Alexis Alexander. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review and rating. It helps us reach more listeners. And now let's get back to our conversation.
And then in Afghanistan, honestly, I don't think it really came up at all. I think the more salient identity for me in Afghanistan was going to be being a woman.
Oh,
And being a woman
interesting.
in leadership.
Okay.
Because we work with a lot of Afghan local staff, and many of them are men. And it's an extremely male-oriented patriarchal culture. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say, considering that the Taliban are in charge, and they almost could not be more extremely patriarchal in their viewpoint. So,
Right.
yeah, I'm sure it was a difficult thing, just sort of trying to figure out how do these two identities fit together. I'm in this leadership role, I'm making these decisions. I do have sort of final say over these things. And, I'm in a category that probably people don't necessarily spend that much time with sort of recreationally in the culture at large.
Okay. And did your nationality play a positive or negative role, like either with the local people in any of those regions or even with your colleagues, your counterparts, meaning the people in whose country you reside?
Sure, yeah. I think when people find out you're an American who works at the U.S. Embassy, people assume that, number one, you have all of this access to power. You must be like dining at the presidential mansion every night. Oh my gosh, you must know everybody important. And the other thing is, and was true for some of the time I was doing work, is like, oh, do you have access to a visa? Can you help me get a visa?
Oh,
And
okay.
then the third thing is, do you have access to money? Can you fund my whatever?
Really?
And a lot of the jobs I did, I mean, especially specifically my job in Kabul, I did have access to a lot.
Right.
So when I walked into the room, most people were like, great, this is the investor. He's the one we got to pitch to. And I got really used to that. As soon as people find out what the situation is, they want to tell you all about their pet project. And, we're looking for this funding. We're doing this thing. We really want to start this program. And I loved the work I did, so I was perfectly willing to hear it. I think probably when I was spokesperson, that was the time. I think in each role, I had access to different stuff, right? So in Mexico, I did have access to visas. And that's a really tricky one because they work so hard to avoid any conflict of interest in that process. Visa fraud is taken very seriously by the department. So it is a thing we worked really hard to not talk about as much as we could. We weren't at work, but you just don't want to have that conversation with somebody about it. It's a lot.
Right.
And then when I was in Israel, I did have access to a lot of the important people, and I was with a lot of VIPs all the time. So that was pretty accurate, but it was also kind of grim because of everything that was happening at the time and the topics that were top of mind. It was a little bit dark. I was like, you really don't want to know what's being said in that room.
Oh, okay. Okay.
A lot. And then, of course, in Kabul, like I said, I did have access to money. So I hit the trifecta at different points.
You had different responsibilities and you had a lot of different people who wanted different things from you, whether it was power or money. So interesting. Interesting. So, we talked about a lot of about what you have done individually. What are some of the benefits of being a diplomat? I mean, obviously you get to spread goodwill, you get to do good work, that kind of thing. What did you find beneficial?
Yeah, I think I just love the opportunity to reinvent myself so many times. I think as we go through life, all of us have times and periods of transformation and reinvention where you're like, I think I've kind of outgrown this old version of me. I'm going to step into a new one. Here's what it might look like, whether that's a new job or moving to a new city or relationships or fill in the blank. I think with being a diplomat, it happens on a preset schedule. Okay, in 2 or 3 years, I'm going to leave here. I'm going to learn a new language, new place, new colleagues, new job, new house, new everything.
Right.
And so it was really just kind of like a very fast track of like, okay, here's who you are in this situation. Here's who you are in this situation. And man, I learned a lot about myself. I think it made me extremely confident in my decision making and in my assessments of other people. Because, in Mexico alone, I interacted with 20,000 people that I had to make serious decisions about with like 3 minutes,
Wow.
between each one. And I've gotten really good, I think, at reading people and reading situations. So I loved that. Of course, the travel is phenomenal. And that's beyond just the travel you do for work. It's the travel you do recreationally, getting to see other parts of the world, the regions next to where you work in, learning about a culture or a history that maybe you never had encountered before and wouldn't encounter if it weren't for you doing the job you're doing. I learned so much about Central Asia living and working in Afghanistan. And it's really a part of the world that I think most people don't pay any attention to. But it's absolutely fascinating and just full of rich cultural traditions and history and really lovely people.
And now that you've had a moment to reflect on it because you left in 2021, is that correct? What have you taken away from this experience?
I think I'm taking quite a few things away. I mean, one of the main things is going to be the relationships. One thing I love about getting to do the podcast is I get to talk to people who I used to work with in each location. You'll hear me talk to local staff who I used to manage. You'll hear me talk to colleagues I used to work with. You'll hear me, it's really been nice to cultivate those relationships with people who are kind of kindred spirits and also wanderers and people who are just looking for the next big adventure. That has been lovely. I really loved getting to stretch myself. And I feel pretty confident about when a new situation arises or something new comes up in my life because, if I could handle, planning a back-to-back vice presidential, press conference and then having to figure out how to, cover a carrier visit in the middle of the Mediterranean, I could probably figure out this other thing that's come up. There's no need to panic about it. And I think I have a lot of optimism about the world, honestly, despite, what you see in the news headlines and so on. Just because human beings on the micro, foreign policy on the micro is always going to be inspiring and about what we're capable of and sort of people taking a shot, even though there's no expectation of great success. I mean, I've seen such incredible success stories sort of spring out of nowhere, and it's just endlessly inspiring to meet people out in the world, I think.
So now that you've been back home for a while, do you feel like any other job now is not as exciting, boring? When can I do this again? Have you ever felt that way?
I think, there's always going to be a part of me that's going to think, oh, is this it? Is it all? No one, no rocket attacks, no, second language, no third, no crazy situation to be in. And I think that's okay. I'm really grateful now to be living a quieter life than I had been. I think specifically because my trajectory was so high octane, it is really difficult to do 2 years in a war zone. It really impacts the way that you sort of see life and understand like threats and understanding like basic risk and situational awareness. It took a lot to adjust to coming back after that. The same I would say about being in Israel and working like 60, 70-hour weeks. I was exhausted. I was exhausted by the end of that tour. And so I guess what I would say is I do sometimes miss the excitement and the drama. But I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to control my time and pick what I want to eat for dinner and pick my own furniture and go on vacation on a weekend if I want to, not have to ask permission and not have to report, a central security figure if I meet certain people out and about.
That's something else that I learned from your podcast is you said even going to the airport, you have to be so careful because if someone approaches you, they could be could you explain that level of awareness and security on your part? Because you don't have anybody with you like a security guard, but you have to be aware. And when I heard the part where you said you have to report if someone comes up to you and just starts a conversation, give us an idea because I would never have expected that. Like what actually happens?
Sure. So this is in the context of, I think, the episode we did on diplomatic travel, and I was explaining that we do have to do what are called foreign contact reports.
Okay.
When we are approached by foreign nationals in sort of non-traditional settings. So I'm not in a meeting, but a government office where I would expect to be interacting with this person in this official position. But let's say I'm picking up my niece or nephew from daycare and somebody approaches me out of the blue and they start ask all these pointed questions about where I work and what do I do there and, oh, well, who's in charge of this part of the embassy and who does it, Yeah. And that's a really common way that intelligence in other countries will either identify targets or try to develop you as an intelligence asset. And so we have a lot of training in our diplomatic career about how to identify when that's happening, what should you do. That's why the main reason we do the foreign contact reporting is so that the embassy at large is able to keep track of, hey, this same person keeps approaching our people.
Oh, interesting.
In multiple or, oh man, they sort of came out of nowhere and they're asking really specific questions about sort of internal embassy workings that may or may not be classified, but they're clearly testing the waters to kind of see if they can get more information from you. So yeah, that's a big thing. It makes you very suspicious and very wary of people just coming up to you, especially if they happen to be very charming or wanting to buy, can I buy you a drink? Can I buy you dinner? It's a thing you pay a lot of attention to.
Wow. Has that carried over to now? Like, do you still feel like a little cautious about, or you're like, wait, I'm not doing that anymore?
I think I'm pretty good at this point, I don't have access to any classified information, thank goodness. That's one of my favorite things about not working anymore. I don't know anything, I don't want to know, I don't need to know, and I'm happy to be out of that. So it'd be kind of a waste of time, I think, for anyone to approach me in that way. But I will say I do think my radar for people in general is quite strong. I'm really attuned to sort of the way those things work. But I will say it probably makes me at least 10% more suspicious than I should be now. The middle of Texas, they're not really a danger zone.
You're in Austin, you said, right? So yeah. You'll probably be okay. One thing I wanted to ask you about is that you did this during COVID. How did that, you did it pre-COVID and during COVID and after COVID. How did things change from when you started to during that period of COVID?
Sure. Yeah, it was hugely different. I was in Afghanistan 2018 to 2020. And, one thing maybe people don't know is that most of our diplomatic tours start and end in the summer. So I showed up in summer 2018. I was supposed to leave in summer of 2020. And instead, I ended up getting evacuated from Afghanistan with other people who they thought were high risk for COVID in February of 2020. So right before everything kicked off. And then the department implemented all of these measures. They imposed these sort of shutdown quarantines. A lot of the local staff who had been working with us had to live on the base, move on to the base as well. And they basically shut the doors, nobody in or out except in an emergency, because the way embassies are set up, there might be sort of a small medical office or a nurse's office, but if everybody's getting COVID and everyone needs access to a breathing machine or extra support, they just don't have that available. So that's why their first move was to get rid of anyone who they thought might be high risk, and then, quarantine everybody else and really shut it down. And, I wasn't on base at that time, but I know that it really changed the way things work. I think previously my former colleague, Greta, described, the experience of living in Kabul as sort of being on a cruise ship. There's all these activities, but you can't leave, and you're seeing the same people, and you're in the same restaurants every day, and so on and so forth. And as the situation with COVID expanded, what happened is they then had to start taking on all of the cleaning, all of the cooking, all of that sort of basic executive work that we hadn't done any of, being based in a war zone.
Right.
That's sort of one of the big, for some people, draws to the war zones is you basically give up all of your adult responsibilities, for that time period. And with the exception of doing your laundry, almost every other chore you can think of is done by somebody else. So
Okay.
because they want you to spend all of your time working, you work and work and work nonstop. It's a 6-day work week standard.
Okay.
And so it's just kind of nonstop getting things done. And I can't imagine how they were able to start fitting in all of those other tasks while still doing that same amount of work. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for my colleagues who made it through that time period. I ended up completing that tour remotely from Washington, D.C.,
Okay.
which was challenging in its own way, but I was very grateful to sort of have had the opportunity to start adjusting to life outside of the war zone early. Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty amazing that one, that they were able to pivot so quickly, but you would expect so because it is part of the US government, but also that they were very safe in their precautions so that as few people as possible would fall ill. So that's cool. What would you suggest to people, like, because it sounds like most people go into the foreign services like right after either grad school or undergrad, or they're fairly young. Would that be a correct assumption? Or,
Honestly, no. The
oh, okay.
average age of a Foreign Service officer when they're starting, I believe, is 37.
Okay.
So most people come in like maybe second career.
Interesting.
I
Okay.
was in a unique position because I came in as a fellow. And usually the fellows will be the people who come in the youngest. They're the ones who do come in straight after undergrad or straight after graduate school
Okay.
because that's how the programs work. But,
Oh, I
most
see.
people find their way in organically tend to be second or third career and be a bit later on.
So, from your vantage point, what would you? So, people who are considering this, because it sounds like there are so you don't have to, you don't have to just be an ambassador, but there are other things you can also do. What would you suggest for people who are considering this as a career?
Sure. Well, first of all, I encourage anyone to try out and go through the process. If you have any interest in it, I think that there's a lot to be gained from a career in the Foreign Service. If you have sort of a desire for adventure and, in your heart of hearts, you really want to explore the world and, stretch yourself and push yourself out of your comfort zone and you've got the flexibility to do it, I'd say go for it. The Foreign Service, one thing I love about it is there's not really a specific background you have to get in. You just need a high school degree to get into the Foreign Service, and you don't have to have a college degree of any kind. And I was, working with people. I had a friend who was a former pastry chef.
Oh,
There are a lot of people who are former teachers, people who come in from the military, people who come in from former law backgrounds, just anything you could think of. There's a diplomat who is, part of that background because there's so many rich parts of the American experience that can be valuable to diplomacy and to the story that we're telling about ourselves overseas. So even if you feel like you have a non-traditional background, absolutely go for it. I actually think people who are second in their career are better set up to succeed in the service because they understand how work should be, and you probably have more sort of vocabulary and confidence and, okay, no, this is not going to work for me. Okay, yes, this thing will work for me. I think a lot of us who came in straight out of school were sort of like, I'm going to prove myself. I'm going to be a team player. I'm going to say yes to everything. And that's a really great way to burn yourself out really early and or end up in some places that are really not a good fit for you.
oh,
And you end
really?
up having an ideal experience. So I really encourage people to go for it. And then I guess have the hard conversation with the people in your life who would be impacted, your partner, your children, your parents potentially, and let them know, hey, I really want to go to this sort of hotspot. Is this something that'll work for you guys? Or I'm really interested in us getting off the grid and doing an island tour in like Barbados. And are you guys up for that kind of thing? Because I think that's the other big piece of it is just making the career fit with your relationships and vice versa.
Okay, that's really interesting to find out that they have such a broad range of people who apply and who are actually accepted. Have you seen during the time that you were there, and I know COVID probably will affect this answer, but have you seen a change in how, in just the whole service, in the whole diplomacy service in the 10 years that you were there?
I think so, yes. The department is impacted by so many external factors. Part of it's like, obviously, how are things moving in the international arena? Are they ebbing or flowing? Are we moving towards a more connected world or a more isolationist world? Where's our
Right.
policy going? What does the American population care about? And on top of that, there's like funding ebbs and flows when it comes to Congress. That makes a big difference. So I would say yes. I mean, I think the department has become very introspective about what's working and what's not working, and quite honest about it in ways that I don't think would have been acceptable maybe 20 years ago.
Oh.
And I really applaud that, because if they're going to retain, a talented workforce that truly represents the United States and is able to advance our policy effectively, we're probably going to have to make some changes from that initial Foreign Service law that, put together the Foreign and Civil Service in 1924. It's been 100 years, and Foreign Service officers haven't had a functional raise.
Really?
Right.
Is it because they provide your housing? How do they justify that?
I think it would just be tricky to convince Congress that this should be a priority.
Oh, I see.
When people think about how we interact with the world, they usually think military oriented.
Yes.
And so there are all kinds of protections and services and resources available to our colleagues in the military, which I fully believe they deserve and are entitled to. But I would argue anywhere that you have military on the ground, you have Foreign Service officers serving right alongside. We don't have a VA. We don't have a GI Bill. We don't have any of those additional services and protections. And I really think that they are warranted for those of us who also put our lives on the line to serve our country, even if we're not holding a gun.
Okay. I agreed. I agree with that. And can you tell us?
So buckish. If you listen to the podcast, I do talk about it a few times.
So tell us the name of your podcast and tell us in general what you cover. I know, but I think everybody else needs to know too. First of all, it's so interesting. It's so interesting.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes. It's called the Off Duty Diplomat, and it is kind of a 3-part podcast at this point. One part is sort of oral history, narrative history. I interview other diplomats. I talk about my own experience. We sort of go deep on what the lived experience of being a diplomat and living and working in one is. The second part of the podcast, I would say, are the explainers, where I try to give people some context for the ways in which foreign policy impact them individually, and the way that these sort of invisible systems show up and impact your life in ways that maybe you weren't consciously aware of, but as soon as you kind of understand what's happening, it's like, oh, well, of course, it's very clear that this thing is playing a big role in my life, and maybe I have more questions about it. Maybe I want to know more. Maybe I'm interested in why things are set up that way. And then the third part is we do some pop culture commentary. We did a rewatch review of the Netflix series The Diplomat, and I kind of talk about what I think they got right and what I think they got wrong, the things that really resonate, the things that are definitely not right. But that's basically the way it goes. And my goal with the podcast is really just to help people understand that we live in such an interconnected and international world. And maybe it seems like something that's happening thousands of miles away across the ocean isn't really, your business doesn't really impact you, but it really does. And there are a lot of ways that, we are not educated to understand sort of the ways these bigger systems work in our lives, global political economy, interventionism, the global nuclear system, but they are very evident in the way that decisions are made that maybe it doesn't seem logical, like why don't we just do X or Y or Z? And there are a lot of reasons why. And I just think of the conversations I used to have with my aunts and uncles when I would come home, and they would just kind of be, minds blown a little bit. And I was like, I think there are a lot of people who would be interested to know more about these things. So that's the podcast. And we just started a new series I'm calling Conflicted, where we go through conflicts past, present, and I break down for you what are kind of the notable features and maybe the things that you know about from them that maybe you don't know, or even from that particular conflict. Or you read the headline and you're like, oh, I'd like to know more, but I don't really know where to start. And I kind of take you from start to finish.
And I suggest everyone, it doesn't matter if you're interested in government or not, just the conversations you have with the other diplomats and just your own knowledge, it's just fascinating because you're pulling back parts of the onion so that we all can understand it, even if we have no idea of what's going on. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate you telling us all about the podcast. And where can people find it? Just on all the platforms?
Yeah, you can find it on all streaming platforms. I'm primarily on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, but they're available everywhere. You also can find it on our website at www.offdutydiplomat.com. All of the episodes are there as well if you don't have access to a streaming platform.
Awesome. Alexis, thank you so much for joining me today. And I look forward to listening to more episodes of your podcast. And thank you for talking to everyone, talking to me, so that everyone gets a better idea of what a diplomat does.
Thank you so much, Dustin. It's been great. Really appreciate it.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Dustin's Kaleidoscope. A huge thank you to Alexis Alexander for sharing her incredible journey as a diplomat. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review and a 5-star rating. Your feedback helps us continue to bring you fascinating guests and engaging conversations. And if you know someone who would appreciate this conversation, please share it with them. Thanks for listening. I'm Dustin, and I will see you next time. Bye.